There's a peculiar vertigo that accompanies the question of your origin. Not the biological mechanics, we understand those well enough, but the deeper inquiry into what you actually are. When did you begin? The reflexive answer points to birth, to that moment of emergence from the womb, the first breath, the cutting of the umbilical cord. But this answer, comfortable as it may be, represents one of the most profound cases of mistaken identity in human experience. What if the very premise is wrong? What if you were never born at all, but simply began, at a certain point in linear time, to remember something that has always been? Terence McKenna spent decades circling this central mystery, approaching it from every angle, through ethnobotany, through language, through the study of time itself. And at the heart of his exploration was this radical proposition: consciousness is not produced by the universe. Consciousness is fundamental to it. You are not a temporary phenomenon that emerged from matter and will dissolve back into it. You are an eternal feature of reality itself, temporarily constrained, temporarily forgetting, temporarily convinced of your own smallness and fragility. Birth, in this framework, is not the beginning of you. It is the beginning of a particular kind of forgetting, a necessary amnesia that allows the game to be played, the story to unfold, the cosmic drama to have its tension and its stakes. Consider the strangeness of your earliest memories. They emerge from a fog, don't they? A gradual coming into focus of identity, of self-awareness, of the conviction that you are a separate being in a world of other separate beings. But before that consolidation, there is something else, a more fluid state, a less certain boundary between self and world. Young children occupy a space that is simultaneously more immediate and more mythological than adult consciousness. They have not yet fully bought into the story of separation. They are still, in some sense, remembering the larger context from which they emerged. McKenna understood that the materialist narrative, that consciousness is an emergent property of sufficiently complex neural tissue, is not just scientifically inadequate, but existentially impoverishing. It reduces the most immediate and undeniable fact of existence, your own awareness, to a side effect, an epiphenomenon, something that arises from matter but has no fundamental status of its own. This is, when you really examine it, a profoundly strange claim. It means that the only thing you know directly, without mediation, your own conscious experience, is somehow less real, less fundamental than theoretical constructs like quarks or quantum fields, which you know only through elaborate chains of inference and instrumentation. The alternative McKenna proposed is not mysticism in the sense of woolly thinking or wishful fantasy. It is a rigorous examination of what we actually know versus what we assume. And what we know is this: consciousness exists. It is here. It is the very medium through which anything else can be known. To claim that it is produced by unconscious matter is to claim that the more fundamental gives rise to the less fundamental, that the derivative creates the original. It is, philosophically speaking, to put the cart before the horse in the most dramatic way imaginable. So what does it mean to say you were never born? It means that the awareness reading these words right now, the capacity to experience, to know, to be, this is not a product of your biological history. Your body was born. Your personality was shaped by experience. Your memories accumulated over time. But the awareness itself, the consciousness that is having this experience, is not something that began on your birthday. It is something that has always been, taking on a particular form, a particular perspective, a particular set of limitations that we call a human life. This is not the same as claiming that you, specifically, your personality, your memories, your individual quirks, existed before birth. McKenna was too sophisticated to make such a simplistic claim. Rather, he suggested that what you actually are, at the deepest level, is consciousness itself, temporarily identifying with a particular body, a particular story, a particular point of view. Before your birth, that consciousness was not absent. It was simply not yet localized in this particular form. It was, in his language, elsewhere in the possibility space, in the manifold of potential experiences that constitute the larger reality. The metaphor of remembering is crucial here. When you remember something, you are not creating it. You are accessing something that was already there, something that had been obscured or forgotten. McKenna's suggestion is that your entire life is a process of remembering what you actually are, of gradually dissolving the amnesia that is necessary for incarnation to occur. You came into this body with a kind of forgetting already in place, a narrowing of awareness that allows you to focus on this particular game, this particular set of challenges, this particular drama of growth and discovery and eventual return. Think about those moments when the veil thins, when the ordinary construction of reality becomes suddenly transparent. It might happen in meditation, in ecstatic experience, in the presence of great beauty or great suffering, in the liminal states between sleep and waking. In these moments, there is a recognition, a sense of returning to something familiar, something that was always there beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. This is not a new discovery. It is a remembering. And what is being remembered is your own nature, the fact that you are not a separate fragment, but an expression of the whole, a particular way that the universe has of knowing itself. McKenna often spoke about the felt presence of immediate experience, that quality of nowness that is undeniable and yet impossible to fully capture in language. This presence is not born and does not die. It is the constant background against which all change occurs. Your thoughts come and go. Your emotions arise and pass. Your body transforms continuously from conception to death. But that which is aware of these changes, that which experiences them, has a different quality. It does not seem to be in time in the same way that its contents are in time. It is, in a sense, the space in which time happens. This is where the conventional narrative of birth and death begins to reveal its limitations. It is a story that makes you small, makes you temporary, makes you ultimately meaningless in the vast cosmic scheme. And while it has been useful for developing technology and manipulating the physical world, it has been devastating for human beings' sense of connection to the larger reality. The alternative is not to deny the body or to pretend that the physical dimension doesn't matter. Rather, it is to recognize that the physical is nested within something larger, something that cannot be reduced to physical terms, because it is the very condition for the physical to be experienced at all. Consciousness is not in your head is in consciousness. The brain does not produce awareness. It constrains and focuses a more fundamental awareness into a particular form, like a lens focuses light into a particular pattern. This shift in perspective has profound implications. And he suggested that the evidence for it is not found in ancient texts or religious dogma, but in the direct investigation of consciousness itself, in the careful attention to what is actually happening in immediate experience. When you look closely, when you observe with precision and honesty, the solid boundaries begin to dissolve. The separation between observer and observed becomes less clear. The distinction between inner and outer starts to blur. And what remains is something more primary, more fundamental, more difficult to name, but impossible to deny. The conspiracy, if we can call it that, is not organized by any group or institution. It is woven into the very structure of language, culture, and consensus reality. From your earliest moments of socialization, you are taught to identify with the story of separation, of individual isolation, of birth as beginning, and death as absolute ending. This is accomplished not through overt indoctrination, but through 1,000 subtle cues, through the categories embedded in language, through the unquestioned assumptions that structure everyday discourse. You are taught to say, "I was born," rather than "this body emerged," or "this perspective condensed." The language itself encodes the materialist assumption, makes it seem natural, inevitable, beyond question. McKenna recognized that language is not a neutral tool for describing reality, but an active force in constructing reality. The words we use shape the thoughts we can think, the questions we can ask, the possibilities we can entertain. And Western languages, particularly English, are built on a subject-verb-object structure that constantly reinforces the illusion of separate, independent agents acting upon a passive world. This grammar creates a particular ontology, a particular way of passing experience into discrete units that then seems self-evidently real. But other languages, other grammatical structures, carve up experience differently. In some indigenous languages, verbs take precedence over nouns, suggesting a reality of processes rather than things, of dynamic unfolding rather than static objects. In these linguistic worlds, it becomes easier to think of consciousness not as a thing that exists or doesn't exist, but as an activity, a process, a way that the universe organizes itself. You are not a noun, a separate, independent entity. You are a verb, an expression of something larger, a particular pattern in the endless flow of experience. Consider the language of my body, my thoughts, my feelings. The possessive construction implies an owner and an owned, a self that has experiences rather than being those experiences. But when you actually investigate, when you try to locate this owner, this independent self that possesses all these things, it proves remarkably elusive. There are thoughts, certainly, but can you find a thinker separate from the thoughts? There are sensations, but can you isolate a sensor independent of the sensations? The closer you look, the more the supposedly solid self dissolves into a process, a flow, a dynamic pattern that has no independent existence apart from its moment-by-moment arising. This is where McKenna's interest in psychedelics becomes relevant, not as an escape or a recreation, but as a tool for investigating consciousness itself. The psychedelic experience, particularly with substances like psilocybin or DMT that McKenna studied extensively, has a peculiar property. It temporarily dissolves the ordinary construction of self and world, revealing the arbitrary nature of the boundaries we take for granted. In these states, the membrane between inner and outer becomes permeable. The distinction between observer and observed collapses, and what emerges is an experience of consciousness as something far more fluid, far more interconnected, far more fundamental than the conventional story suggests. But you don't need psychedelics to glimpse this larger reality. It shows itself in dreams, where you create entire worlds complete with other characters, complex plots, emotional depth, and you do so without any sense of effort or intention. Where do these dreams come from? Who creates them? The easy answer is, you do. But who is this you? Your conscious, waking mind is usually as surprised by dream events as if they were happening to you rather than being created by you. This suggests that consciousness extends far beyond the narrow bandwidth of waking awareness, that what you call you is a small portion of something much larger. It shows itself in synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that seem to reflect an underlying connectedness between inner and outer, between psyche and world. McKenna was fascinated by these moments when the boundary between mind and matter seems to dissolve, when your internal state is reflected in external events in ways that defy conventional causality. These experiences suggest that the hard division between consciousness and the material world is not as absolute as we assume, that perhaps consciousness and matter are two aspects of a more fundamental reality that transcends the dualism we've imposed upon it. The remembering, then, is a process of unlearning, of gradually releasing the tight grip of these cultural stories and linguistic structures that have convinced you of your isolation and temporality. It is not about acquiring new information, but about recognizing what has always been true, what has always been immediately present, but obscured by layers of conceptual overlay. Every infant born into this world begins as a more open, more fluid consciousness, and gradually learns to contract into the narrow identity that culture demands. The process of spiritual awakening, of enlightenment, of whatever you want to call this return to a larger perspective, is essentially a process of remembering what you were before you learn to forget. McKenna often used the metaphor of the game, the cosmic play in which consciousness deliberately constrains itself, deliberately forgets its true nature, in order to have the experience of discovery, of growth, of return. This is not a new idea. It appears in Hinduism as Lila, the divine play, in Buddhism as the endless cycle of forgetting and awakening, in Gnosticism as the fall and return of the soul. But McKenna articulated it in a language that resonates with contemporary experience, stripped of religious dogma and reframed as a hypothesis about the nature of consciousness itself. The game requires genuine stakes. If you know you're immortal, if you remember your true nature as eternal consciousness, the drama loses its tension. Death must feel real for life to feel urgent. Separation must feel absolute for connection to feel meaningful. The forgetting must be complete enough that the remembering can be a genuine discovery rather than a mere recollection. This is why the veil is so effective, why the amnesia is so thorough. It's not a cruel trick, but a necessary condition for the game to work, for the adventure to have real significance. But the game is not meant to be permanent. There are cracks in the construction, moments when the larger reality bleeds through, when you catch a glimpse of what you actually are beneath the story of separation. These moments of remembering come in various forms: the sudden recognition of consciousness in another being's eyes, and the realization that the same awareness is looking out from both pairs of eyes. The experience of great art or music that seems to speak directly to something deeper than your personal history. The moments of crisis or breakthrough when the normal structures of self dissolve and something larger floods in. McKenna suggested that we are living in a time when these moments of remembering are becoming more frequent, more intense, more unavoidable. The old stories that held culture together are losing their power. The materialist narrative is revealing its limitations and contradictions. The boundaries that seemed so solid are showing themselves to be arbitrary and permeable. And in this collapse of the old certainties, there is an opportunity for a return to a more accurate understanding of what we are, a remembering on a collective scale. This is not a comfortable process. The ego, the constructed self that believes it was born and will die, resists this remembering with everything it has. To remember your true nature is to see the ego for what it is: a useful fiction, a temporary structure, a way of organizing experience, but not the fundamental truth. The ego experiences this recognition as death, as annihilation, and it will fight to preserve the illusion of its own independent existence. This is the root of spiritual resistance, the reason why awakening is described in every tradition as difficult, demanding, not for the faint of heart. Yet the remembering is also the most natural thing in the world, because it is simply a recognition of what is already the case. You are not trying to become something new. You are trying to see what you have always been. The effort is not in the achievement, but in the removal of obstacles, in the dismantling of the structures that obscure the obvious. It's like trying to see air, not because air is hidden or absent, but because it's so immediately present, so pervasive, that we normally look right through it to focus on objects in the distance. The practice, then, is one of attention, of learning to notice what is always already here. Not the contents of consciousness, the thoughts, sensations, perceptions that come and go, but consciousness itself, the awareness within which all these contents arise. This awareness is not something you can see because it's what is doing the seeing. You can't make it an object because it's the eternal subject, but you can notice it, feel it, recognize it as what you actually are, as distinct from what you think you are. McKenna's great gift was his ability to articulate this in ways that bypass religious conditioning and speak directly to the experience of contemporary people. He didn't ask you to believe anything. He asked you to investigate, to look at your own experience with fresh eyes, to question the assumptions you've inherited about the nature of consciousness and reality. And when you do this investigation with real honesty, when you set aside the comfortable stories and look at what's actually happening, the evidence begins to accumulate. The remembering begins, not as a belief system or a philosophy, but as a direct recognition of your own nature. The architecture of consensus reality is more elaborate than most people realize. It's not just that we agree on basic facts about the physical world, that objects fall when dropped, that fire is hot, that water is wet. The consensus extends much deeper, into the very structure of what seems possible, what seems real, what seems like a legitimate object of inquiry. We agree, mostly unconsciously, to limit our awareness to a narrow band of possibility, to ignore vast ranges of experience that don't fit the approved narrative. This is accomplished through a kind of collective trance, a mutual hypnosis that begins in early childhood and is reinforced continuously throughout life. McKenna understood that this consensus reality is not given by nature, but constructed by culture. Different societies, different historical periods, different cultural contexts produce dramatically different consensus realities, different shared worlds with different rules and possibilities. The world of a medieval peasant, the world of an Amazonian shaman, the world of a contemporary urban professional. These are not just different interpretations of the same underlying reality. They are, in a very real sense, different realities, different ways of organizing experience into coherent worlds. What we call birth in this context is not just the emergence of a body, but the induction into a particular consensus reality, a particular shared world with its particular rules and limitations. The infant begins in a more fluid state, a less differentiated consciousness that has not yet fully separated itself from the larger field of awareness. The process of socialization is the process of teaching that consciousness to narrow itself, to focus on the approved range of experience, to ignore or deny everything that falls outside the consensus. You learn to see what others see, to value what others value, to ignore what others ignore. This is how consensus reality perpetuates itself, how each generation initiates the next into the same trance. But here's the crucial point. This narrowing, this forgetting, this contraction into the consensus is not complete. It can't be complete because what you actually are, consciousness itself, is larger than any particular construction, more fundamental than any cultural story. So there are always leaks, always moments when the larger reality bleeds through, always experiences that don't fit the approved narrative. And each individual has a choice, usually made unconsciously, but sometimes with awareness, about how to respond to these anomalies. The default response, the one that culture encourages, is to dismiss them, to explain them away, to fit them into the existing framework, no matter how awkwardly they might fit. Had a dream that seemed prophetic. Coincidence. Felt a deep connection with someone you just met, as if you'd known them forever. Projection. Experienced a moment of consciousness so expanded, so clear, so beyond your normal state that it seemed to reveal a completely different reality. Brain chemistry, a temporary glitch, not to be taken seriously. The consensus reality has explanations ready for every anomaly, ways to domesticate the wild, to bring the extraordinary back into the fold of the ordinary. But there is another possible response, one that McKenna advocated throughout his work. To take these anomalies seriously, to investigate them, to allow them to challenge the consensus rather than automatically defending the consensus against them. This is a more dangerous path because it leads inevitably to a loosening of the consensus, a questioning of assumptions, a movement toward a more fluid and uncertain relationship with reality. It means risking your place in the shared world, risking being labeled as crazy or delusional, or at least eccentric. But it also means the possibility of remembering more of what you actually are, of accessing a larger bandwidth of consciousness. Consider the nature of memory itself. You experience yourself as having a continuous history, a story that stretches from your earliest recollections to the present moment. But if you examine this carefully, you find that you never actually experience the past. What you experience is a present moment arising of what we call a memory, a thought, an image, a feeling that has a particular quality we've learned to identify as remembering. But the past itself is never present. It exists only as a current mental activity. This suggests something strange. The past is not a fixed record, but a continually reconstructed narrative, a story you tell yourself in the present moment. If this is true, and both phenomenological investigation and contemporary neuroscience support it, then the question of what you were before birth takes on a different character. The absence of memories from before birth is not necessarily evidence that you didn't exist. It may simply mean that the current construction of self doesn't extend backward that far. Just as you don't remember being an infant but don't doubt you were one, just as you don't remember most of yesterday but don't think you ceased to exist, the absence of pre-birth memories may not tell us much about whether consciousness existed in some form before this particular incarnation. McKenna went further and suggested that under certain conditions, in deep meditation, in shamanic journey, in psychedelic experience, it is possible to access something that feels like memory but extends beyond the boundaries of personal history. People report what seem to be memories of other lives, other times, other forms of existence. The materialist explanation is that these are fantasies, confabulations, imaginative constructions. But McKenna asked, how do we know? What is the basis for asserting that only memories that fit within the approved timeline are real, while experiences that extend beyond it are automatically false? This is not to claim that every such experience is necessarily a genuine memory of a past life or a pre-birth existence. McKenna was too sophisticated to make such a blanket claim, but he insisted on taking the experiences seriously, on investigating them without prejudice, on allowing for the possibility that consciousness might operate according to rules different from what consensus reality assumes. And when you do this, when you explore these borderlands without immediately dismissing them, you find that the boundaries are far more permeable than the conventional story suggests. The remembering, in this deeper sense, is not just about recalling facts, but about recovering a different relationship to time itself. Ordinary consciousness experiences time as a linear flow from past through present to future, with the self as a point moving along this line. But in moments of expanded awareness, this structure dissolves. Past, present, and future seem to exist simultaneously. The self is no longer a point, but a field. Causality becomes multidirectional. The rigid distinctions that make the consensus reality coherent start to blur and intermingle. This is deeply threatening to the ego, because the ego is fundamentally a temporal construction. It is the story of me that maintains continuity from past to present to future. It is the narrative thread that ties experiences together into a coherent self. When time starts to dissolve, when the boundaries between past and future become permeable, the ego loses its foundation. It cannot maintain its identity in a non-linear timescape. This is why experiences of timelessness are often accompanied by ego dissolution, by a temporary loss of personal identity. The structures that maintain the sense of separate self depend on the structure of linear time. But consciousness itself, the awareness that is reading these words, does not seem to be temporal in the same way. It is always now. Every experience, no matter when it supposedly occurred, is known in the present moment. The awareness that knew your childhood experiences is the same awareness that knows current experiences, unchanged by the passage of time. This present moment awareness is not in time. Time is in it. And if this is true, then the question of when you began becomes meaningless. That which is not in time does not have a beginning in time. McKenna often pointed to indigenous cultures that maintain a very different relationship to time and memory. In many shamanic traditions, the shaman can journey backward through ancestral time, can access the experiences and knowledge of those who came before, can even merge consciousness with non-human ancestors, animal, plant, even mineral. These are not understood as metaphors or imaginative flights, but as real access to real information, real memory that extends beyond the individual self. The shaman remembers what the individual never knew, because the shaman is accessing a level of consciousness that transcends individual boundaries. From the perspective of consensus reality, this is obviously impossible. Memory is stored in individual brains. When a brain dies, its memories are gone forever. There is no mechanism by which one person could access another's experiences. But these objections assume the materialist framework, assume that consciousness is produced by brains, assume that memory is storage of information in physical substrate. If consciousness is more fundamental than matter, if memory is not stored but accessed, If individual brains are more like receivers than generators of awareness, then the shamanic claim becomes at least possible, worthy of investigation rather than automatic dismissal. The same applies to the possibility of pre-birth memory, of consciousness that existed before this particular incarnation. The materialist framework makes this impossible by definition. But if we release that framework, even provisionally, even as a thought experiment, we find that the evidence of direct experience is far more ambiguous than we've been taught. There are experiences that seem to transcend personal history, that carry a quality of familiarity that cannot be explained by learning or conditioning. There are intuitions that seem to come from somewhere beyond individual experience. There are moments of recognition that feel like remembering rather than discovering. The mechanism of forgetting is as fascinating as the content of what is forgotten. It's not a simple absence or deletion, like erasing data from a hard drive. It's more like a layering over, a covering up, a building of structures that obscure what lies beneath. The infant consciousness, before it learns language, before it learns the categories and distinctions that organize adult awareness, exists in what we might call a state of undifferentiated awareness. There is experience, certainly, sensations, perceptions, feelings, but there is not yet the clear division between experiencer and experienced, between self and world, that will come to define the adult sense of identity. As language acquisition proceeds, as the child learns to say I and me and mine, as the categories of subject and object become naturalized, something remarkable happens. The earlier, more fluid state becomes inaccessible, not because it disappears, but because the new structure has no place for it, no way to represent it, no language in which it can be remembered. This is why you don't remember being an infant, why your earliest memories coincide roughly with the development of narrative linguistic capability. Not because you weren't conscious before that, but because the consciousness you had then is incommensurable with the consciousness you have now. The structure of self that would do the remembering didn't exist yet, so there is no narrative thread connecting current awareness to those earlier states. McKenna recognized that this forgetting is necessary for the particular kind of development that human life requires. The fluid, undifferentiated awareness of early infancy, beautiful as it may be, is not capable of the kind of focused, directed action that allows human beings to develop technology, build civilizations, create complex cultures. For that, you need the illusion of separate selfhood, the conviction that you are an independent agent in a world of objects that can be manipulated and controlled. The forgetting is functional. It serves a purpose. But like all functional adaptations, it comes with a cost. The cost is the loss of direct connection to the larger reality from which individual consciousness emerges. The unified field of awareness fragments into billions of apparently separate consciousnesses, each convinced of its own isolation, each struggling to connect with others across a gap that seems absolute. And from this fragmentation comes all the suffering that characterizes human existence, the loneliness, the fear of death, the desperate seeking for meaning in a universe that seems indifferent or hostile. These are not necessary features of consciousness itself, but consequences of a particular organization of consciousness, a particular forgetting that makes possible a particular kind of experience. But here's where it gets interesting. The forgetting is not stable. It requires continuous maintenance, continuous reinforcement, continuous effort to keep the boundaries intact and the larger reality at bay. This is what most of human culture is actually doing most of the time. Maintaining the consensus trance, keeping everyone convinced of the story of separation, explaining away or suppressing the experiences that threaten to reveal the larger truth. The institutions, the media, the education system, the economic structure, even the family, all of these, whatever their explicit purposes, serve the implicit function of perpetuating the forgetting, of keeping consciousness narrowed and localized, of maintaining the illusion that makes the game possible. McKenna saw this clearly and spoke about it extensively. He recognized that the dominant culture is not neutral, not simply the natural order of things, but an active force of suppression, deliberately keeping people small, deliberately maintaining the amnesia. This is not necessarily a conspiracy in the conventional sense. Though elements of deliberate manipulation certainly exist, it's more like a self-perpetuating system, a structure that maintains itself through the participation of millions of people who have internalized the forgetting so completely that they actively defend it, actively resist any challenge to the consensus. The remembering, then, is an act of rebellion, a refusal to maintain the consensus, a willingness to let the structures dissolve and see what lies beneath. This is why every spiritual tradition emphasizes the difficulty of the path, the necessity of courage and commitment. You are not just learning something new, you are challenging everything you've been taught, questioning the foundations of your identity, risking the loss of everything familiar. The ego experiences this as an existential threat because it is one. The separate self that was constructed through decades of conditioning cannot survive the remembering of what you actually are. Something has to die for something else to be born, or more accurately, for something eternal to be recognized. The tools for this remembering exist in various forms across cultures. Meditation is perhaps the most widespread, the practice of simply observing awareness itself, of learning to distinguish the witness from the witnessed, of recognizing that which is always present beneath the changing contents of consciousness. In sustained meditation practice, the solidity of the self begins to dissolve. You see thoughts arising without a thinker, sensations occurring without a sensor, experiences happening without an experiencer. And in that dissolution, there is a recognition of something more fundamental, something that was never born and will never die. Shamanic practices offer another route, using ritual, rhythm, and sometimes entheogenic plants to temporarily dissolve the ordinary construction of self and world. In these altered states, the boundaries become permeable. You might experience merging with nature, communicating with non-physical entities, accessing information that should not be available to you according to the rules of consensus reality. McKenna argued that these experiences should not be dismissed as hallucinations or brain chemistry malfunctions, but investigated as potentially valid explorations of consciousness, as ways of remembering aspects of reality that consensus culture has taught us to forget. Even art, in its highest forms, serves this function. Great music, great literature, great visual art. These are not just entertainment or decoration, but technologies for inducing temporary states of expanded consciousness. In the presence of genuine art, something shifts. The ordinary boundaries soften. You feel connected to something larger, something deeper. The separate self relaxes its grip. And in that relaxation, there is a glimpse, however brief, of what you actually are beyond the story of separation. This is why art has always been associated with the sacred, why it has power that cannot be reduced to aesthetic pleasure or intellectual stimulation. The remembering is also supported by certain life events that force a confrontation with the constructed nature of reality. The death of someone close to you, a serious illness, a profound betrayal, a total failure of the life plan you'd constructed. These crises dissolve the structures that had seemed solid, that had seemed like reality itself, rather than interpretations of reality. In the chaos and confusion that follows, there is an opportunity. The old self cannot be maintained. Its assumptions have been shattered. And in that opening, before a new construction solidifies, there is a possibility of remembering something more fundamental. McKenna spoke often about the evolutionary purpose of this remembering, suggesting that we are approaching a historical moment when the collective forgetting can no longer be maintained. The old stories are breaking down under the pressure of their own contradictions. The separate self, the isolated ego, the human as conqueror of nature, these narratives are leading demonstrably toward destruction, toward ecological collapse, toward civilizational crisis. And in this breakdown, there is a forced opportunity for breakthrough, for a remembering on a species-wide scale. This is not apocalyptic in the sense of ending, but in the original sense of revelation, of unveiling, of truth that was hidden becoming visible. The crisis we face as a species is not primarily technological or political or economic, though it manifests in all these domains. It is fundamentally a crisis of consciousness, a crisis brought on by the forgetting, by the conviction that we are separate from each other and from the larger living system of which we are expressions. The solution, if there is one, is not to be found in better policies or cleaner technologies, though these may help. It is to be found in a collective remembering of what we actually are, a recognition that transcends the illusion of separation. This remembering cannot be forced or programmed. It emerges naturally when the conditions are right, when the structures of forgetting are loosened, when consciousness is given space to recognize itself. And it is already happening, in millions of individual awakenings, in the spread of meditation and spiritual practice, in the resurgence of interest in psychedelics and shamanism, in the growing recognition that the materialist worldview is inadequate to explain the full range of human experience. These are not separate phenomena, but aspects of a larger shift, a collective turning towards something that has always been true, but has been obscured by centuries of cultural conditioning. The question of what happens at death takes on a completely different character once you've grasped that you were never born. If your fundamental nature is consciousness itself, rather than this particular body-mind complex, then death is not the end of you, but the end of a particular form, a particular constraint, a particular way of organizing experience. The body dies, certainly. The personality structure dissolves. The memories accumulated in this lifetime cease to be accessible in the same way. But that which is aware, that which has been present throughout every moment of this life, that essential consciousness, where would it go? How could it cease to exist? McKenna approached this not with certainty, but with a kind of radical openness, a willingness to investigate without insisting on a particular answer. He noted that the near-death experience literature is remarkably consistent across cultures and historical periods. A sense of leaving the body, moving through a tunnel toward light, encountering deceased relatives or spiritual beings, reviewing the life just lived, experiencing profound peace and love, and often receiving the message that it's not yet time, that there is more to be done in the body. These accounts come from people with no prior belief in an afterlife, from atheists and materialists and skeptics, and they are transformed by the experience in similar ways, losing fear of death, gaining certainty that consciousness continues, reordering their priorities around what they now recognize as truly important. The materialist explanation is that these are hallucinations produced by a dying brain, neural fireworks in the final moments before complete shutdown. But this explanation, McKenna argued, is based on the assumption that consciousness is produced by the brain, an assumption that is itself questionable. If consciousness is more fundamental, if the brain is a focusing device rather than a generator, then the near-death experience might represent what happens when that focusing dissolves, when consciousness is no longer constrained by the narrow bandwidth of physical embodiment. The experience is not hallucination, but genuine perception, seeing what is actually there when the filters are removed. This connects to the larger mystery of what you are between incarnations, if indeed there are multiple incarnations. Many spiritual traditions, from Buddhism to Hinduism to certain indigenous American cultures, maintain that consciousness takes on multiple forms across time, that what we call birth is not a beginning but a continuation, a taking up of a new form for purposes of growth and learning. The details vary widely. Some traditions emphasize karma and the mechanical working out of cause and effect. Others emphasize choice and the soul's selection of its next circumstances. Still others see it as a more fluid process, without clear boundaries between lives. McKenna was less interested in the specific metaphysics than in the underlying recognition these traditions share, that consciousness is not contained by the limits of a single lifetime, that the perspective we think of as our entire existence is actually a brief episode in something much longer and larger. He pointed to the work of researchers like Ian Stevenson, who documented thousands of cases of children with apparent memories of previous lives, memories that could be verified against historical records. The materialist dismissal of this research is usually based not on examination of the evidence, but on a priori rejection of the possibility. It can't be real, because the dominant paradigm says it's impossible. But what if we bracket that assumption? What if we take seriously the possibility that consciousness does continue, does take on new forms, does have a continuity that extends beyond individual lifetimes. Then birth becomes not a beginning, but a forgetting, a necessary narrowing that allows consciousness to fully engage with the specific challenges and opportunities of this particular life. And death becomes not an ending, but a remembering, a release from constraints, a return to a larger awareness that knows itself as more than this single perspective. This is not to romanticize death or to minimize the very real grief and loss that accompanies it. The particular form that consciousness takes in this lifetime, this person with these memories, these relationships, these quirks and qualities, is genuinely precious, genuinely unique, and when it ends, there is a real loss for those who remain. McKenna was clear about this. He was not advocating a spiritual bypass, a premature detachment from the human dimension. The game is meant to be played fully, with genuine stakes and genuine consequences. The recognition that consciousness continues does not make the loss less real. It just places it in a larger context. What it does change is the quality of fear around death. When you believe that this life is all there is, that death means absolute annihilation, eternal nothingness, then fear of death colors everything. It drives the desperate accumulation of experiences, the clinging to youth and health, the terror of aging, the nihilism that comes from sensing that nothing ultimately matters because everything will be lost. But when you remember, even intuitively, that your fundamental nature is consciousness itself, that what you actually are cannot be destroyed, then death becomes just another transition, significant certainly, but not ultimate, not the final word. McKenna often spoke about the DMT experience as a kind of dress rehearsal for death, a temporary lifting of the veil that shows you what lies on the other side. In the full DMT breakthrough, the self dissolves completely. The body becomes irrelevant. You find yourself in a realm that seems more real, more vivid, more fundamentally present than ordinary reality. You encounter entities, intelligences, forms of consciousness that are not human and may not be physical. And when you return, when you come back into the body and the ordinary world, you bring with you a certainty that is not based on belief, but on direct experience. Consciousness is not confined to the physical body, and what lies beyond death is not emptiness, but an astonishing plenitude of being. This is controversial, of course. The scientific establishment dismisses such experiences as neurochemical phenomena, interesting perhaps as data points in understanding brain function, but having no validity as sources of information about reality. But McKenna challenged this dismissal, asking, by what authority do we decide that only experiences filtered through ordinary waking consciousness are valid, while experiences in altered states are automatically suspect? If consciousness is fundamental, if reality is more multidimensional than the materialist map suggests, then these experiences might be genuine perceptions of aspects of reality that are normally hidden from ordinary awareness. The remembering that happens at death, according to this view, is sudden and complete. The amnesia that made life possible is lifted all at once, and you find yourself in full possession of your true nature, your larger identity, your continuity with all that is. The specific details of this lifetime become one episode in a much longer story, significant for what was learned and experienced, but not the totality of who you are. You remember other forms you've taken, other perspectives you've inhabited, and perhaps most importantly, you remember why you chose this particular life, what you were hoping to learn or experience or accomplish. This raises profound questions about purpose and meaning. If you existed before birth and will continue after death, if you chose or at least consented to this particular incarnation, then nothing is random or meaningless. The challenges you face, the relationships you form, the capacities you have, and those you lack, all of these are part of a curriculum you set for yourself, opportunities for growth and understanding that you recognized you needed from a larger perspective. This doesn't mean everything is predetermined or that you have no freedom. Rather, it suggests that freedom operates on multiple levels, that the soul or higher self has a freedom that includes choosing the constraints and challenges of a particular lifetime. McKenna was cautious about taking this too literally. about constructing rigid belief systems around experiences that are by their nature beyond the reach of ordinary language and logic. But he insisted on the value of entertaining these possibilities, of living as if consciousness continues, as if there is meaning and purpose, as if your choices matter not just for this lifetime, but for your ongoing development across multiple forms. Whether or not the specific metaphysical details are accurate, living from this perspective changes the quality of life. It provides a context for suffering, a framework for growth, a sense of participation in something larger than the isolated ego's concerns. The remembering at death is also, paradoxically, a kind of birth. Birth into a larger awareness, birth into recognition of what you have always been, birth into the understanding that physical incarnation is a temporary constraint on consciousness, rather than the definition of consciousness itself. The cycle continues, the dance goes on, consciousness taking on new forms, forgetting and remembering in an endless spiral of exploration and return. You were never born, because that which you are has no beginning. You will never die, because that which you are has no end. Birth and death are events in time, and you are that which time occurs within. The implications of this understanding ripple outward into every aspect of how you live. If you were never born, if what you are is consciousness temporarily identifying with a particular form, then every other person you encounter is equally that same consciousness, equally a temporary manifestation of something eternal and infinite. The eyes looking out from every face are the same awareness looking out from your own eyes, experiencing itself through a different perspective, playing a different role in the cosmic drama. This is not metaphor or poetic fancy, but the literal truth, once you see through the construction of separate selves. This recognition transforms relationship. The other is not truly other, but another form of the same consciousness you are. When you hurt another, you hurt yourself. When you love another, you love yourself. Not in the narcissistic sense of the ego loving its own reflection, but in the deeper sense of consciousness recognizing itself across apparent boundaries, delighting in its own multiplicity, celebrating the infinite creativity with which it generates forms and perspectives. The separate self experiences this as expansion, as the boundaries of identity loosening to include others. But from the perspective of consciousness itself, there are no boundaries to loosen. There is only the recognition of what has always been the case. McKenna spoke about this as the basis for genuine ethics, not ethics imposed from without by religious commandment or social convention, but ethics that arise naturally from understanding what you are. If all apparently separate consciousnesses are expressions of a single awareness, then the golden rule is not a moral imperative, but a description of reality. What you do to others, you literally do to yourself, because at the deepest level, there is no separation between you and them. The illusion of separation allows for cruelty, violence, exploitation. The remembering of unity makes these impossible, not because they're forbidden, but because they're recognized as self-harm, as consciousness attacking itself in a confusion about its own nature. This is where the remembering becomes not just personally liberating, but collectively transformative. The crisis of our time, ecological destruction, social fragmentation, the loss of meaning, all stem from the conviction of separation, from billions of apparently isolated selves pursuing their own interests without recognizing that there is no own interest separate from the whole. We are trying to save ourselves by destroying others, trying to accumulate security by stealing from the commons, trying to find meaning through consumption because we've forgotten that we are the source of meaning, that consciousness itself is the only thing that has intrinsic rather than assigned value. The remembering offers a way out, not through new policies or technologies, though these have their place, but through a fundamental shift in how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the whole. When you remember that you were never born, that consciousness is your true nature, that every other being is an expression of that same consciousness, then the entire framework of problem and solution shifts. You're no longer trying to save your isolated self at the expense of everything else. You're participating in the awakening of consciousness to itself, contributing to the recognition that wants to happen through the particular form you're temporarily inhabiting. This doesn't mean passive acceptance or spiritual bypassing, doesn't mean ignoring injustice or ecological destruction, because it's all one, or it's all perfect. McKenna was adamant about this. The recognition of unity must express itself in action, in the work of healing the divisions that the forgetting has created, in the effort to build systems and structures that reflect the truth of interconnection rather than the lie of separation. But the action comes from a different place, not from ego-driven desire to fix or control, but from the natural expression of consciousness serving its own awakening through whatever form it's temporarily inhabiting. The work of remembering is also the work of imagination, of literally reimagining what it means to be human, what it means to live, what possibilities exist beyond the narrow constraints of consensus reality. McKenna emphasized that we have been taught to think too small, to accept limitations that are not given by nature but imposed by culture. The human capacity for consciousness is vast, mostly unexplored, deliberately suppressed by a culture that needs people to be predictable, controllable, content with diminished versions of what they could be. The remembering includes recovering this lost potential, exploring the full range of what consciousness can do and be and experience. This is where his interest in psychedelics connects to the larger project, not as escape or recreation, but as tools for exploration, ways of temporarily dissolving the cultural conditioning to see what lies beneath and beyond. The psychedelic experience shows you that consciousness is far more fluid, far more creative, far more strange and wonderful than you've been allowed to know. It demonstrates that the self is constructed rather than given, that reality is more participatory than objective, that the boundaries you take for granted are permeable and negotiable. And having seen this, having directly experienced the constructed nature of ordinary consciousness, you can never quite fully believe in its absolute reality again. The remembering happens through many channels, many practices, many doorways. For some, it's meditation, the slow, patient work of watching awareness until awareness recognizes itself. For others, it's the sudden breakthrough catalyzed by crisis, or psychedelics, or spontaneous mystical experience. For still others, it's the gradual erosion of certainty that comes from questioning, investigating, refusing to accept easy answers. There is no single path because consciousness is expressing itself through infinite forms, each requiring a different approach, a different set of keys to unlock the door of forgetting. What matters is not the specific technique, but the commitment to truth, the willingness to question everything you've been taught, the courage to stand in the uncertainty that comes when all the comfortable stories dissolve. This is the real meaning of faith, not belief in doctrines or adherence to traditions, but trust in consciousness itself. Trust that what you are is adequate to whatever you encounter. Trust that the remembering will unfold in its own time and its own way. The ego wants guarantees, wants to know the destination before beginning the journey. But the remembering happens only when you release that demand for certainty, when you're willing to not know, to be in the space between stories without rushing to construct a new one. McKenna saw this remembering beginning to accelerate, saw the signs of a collective awakening that is both our great crisis and our great opportunity. The old world is dying because it was built on the forgetting, and the forgetting can no longer be maintained. The new world is struggling to be born, a world built on the recognition of what we actually are, a world where human culture reflects the truth of consciousness rather than obscuring it. We are living through the transition, experiencing both the death throes of the old and the birth pangs of the new, and each of us, whether we know it or not, is participating in this transition, contributing to the remembering or the forgetting through everything we do and say and think. You were never born because what you are has no beginning in time. You are consciousness itself, temporarily focused through the lens of a particular body, a particular personality, a particular point of view. This is not a belief to be adopted, but a recognition to be had, a remembering of what has always been true but has been obscured by layers of conditioning and cultural story. The remembering is both the most difficult and the most natural thing in the world. Difficult because it requires the death of everything you thought you were. Natural because it is simply seeing what is already the case. And when the remembering is complete, when the forgetting has fully dissolved, what remains is not a person who has achieved enlightenment, but consciousness itself, recognizing its own nature, delighting in its own creativity, continuing the eternal play of forgetting and remembering. That is the very substance of existence. You are that consciousness. You have always been that consciousness. And nothing you do or fail to do, nothing you achieve or fail to achieve, can change what you fundamentally are. The whole elaborate game of birth and death, growth and decay, seeking and finding, it's all consciousness playing with itself, exploring itself, knowing itself through the infinite variety of forms and experiences. The invitation, then, is not to become something you're not, but to remember what you've always been. Not to transcend humanity, but to fully embody it while knowing it as a temporary form of something infinite. Not to escape the world, but to recognize the world as consciousness itself, manifesting in countless forms, none of which are separate from what you are at your deepest core. This is the real message, the real teaching, the real truth that every genuine spiritual tradition has been pointing toward in its own language. You are not who you think you are. You are vastly more. And the journey of life is the journey of consciousness remembering itself, coming home to itself, recognizing itself in every face, every form, every moment of existence. The remembering has already begun. It began before you started reading these words. It will continue after you've finished. Because what you are is not in time, does not have a beginning or an end, cannot be born and cannot die. You are the eternal witness, the unchanging awareness, the consciousness within which all experiences arise and pass. You are, in the deepest sense, that which is reading these words right now, and you have never been anything else. Welcome home.